The Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
It is Tuesday, February 18th, 2020. My name is Sam Cedar. This is the five-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live to tape steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal, the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. It is one of our famous We're on Vacation, but Not Really shows, because you're getting all new content, as we call it in the business. Today on the program, continuing on with our series of interviewing progressive challengers to establishment Democrats. In some instances, we have, I think, there's no incumbent. We'll be talking to Morgan Harper, who's running in Ohio's 3rd Congressional District. She is an incredibly impressive candidate. And she's taking on Beatty. Can't remember first name on there. I don't know. I did this interview the other day, a while back, actually. But a Democrat who's been in this seat, frankly, for too long. It's Representative Joyce Beatty. This is a solid Democratic district. Beatty has run unchallenged in every primary since 2014, after getting in there, I think, in 2012. So, Harper worked for 3.5 years at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. She's whip smart, and you're going to love the issues she embraces in this race. We're going to need upgrades to Congress. I mean, look, plan for success. If we get a progressive president in the White House, we're going to want a progressive Congress. We're going to need one, not one who's talking about pay-go and all this other stuff. So Morgan Harper first, and then we'll be talking to Ganesh Sitaraman. This is his second time on the program, I believe. This is for his latest book, The Great Democracy, How to Fix Our Politics, Unrig the Economy, and Unite America. It's basically an agenda for the next president, much of which I think you will embrace. And there are basically two options we have for the future, according to Sitaraman. One is a nationalist oligarchy, and the other one is a great democracy. It's sort of pretty timely at the moment, as this race is starting to shape up. I think in the coming days, I think we're going to see literally in the coming weeks that we're looking at, could be wrong, but a race ultimately between Bernie Sanders and Michael Bloomberg. And the idea that you could literally, I mean, you got to, we will talk more about this in the coming weeks. Michael Bloomberg has come in and bought, just full on bought not just his position in the polls, but his endorsements. I mean, it's stunning. It is stunning. You want to know what an oligarchy looks like? Picasso. Well, Picasso, if they were to actually draw, would look a little distorted. I was just thinking, like, who's a pretty straightforward. Not all the painters I can think of are abstract.
Yeah, maybe Monet. No, I don't know.
What? Monet? No. Are you kidding? No, it would be, what's his face? The guy from, Michelangelo, I guess. Yeah, that was pretty, but the other guy from up north. You know what I'm talking about?
That's how people usually talk about painters.
Yeah, Van somebody. One of those guys. Not Van Gogh. Not Van Gogh. The other one. Ah, shoot. Forget it.
This isn't the art
That's
report.
why I do politics, folks. If you want a art podcast, go somewhere else. Who? What is it?
Yeah, it's not the best medium, a podcast about
Yeah,
art.
exactly. So let's just everybody calm down. The point being that, a graphic artist, a very, very proficient graphic artist.
Not Abraham Van Beveren.
No, it was not Van Beveren. No.
All the Dutch masters.
Yes. A Dutch. Yes, one of the Dutch masters. That's what I'm talking about. Whatever. One of the Dutch masters could not have laid it out more.
One of the Dutch
perfectly. I can't
masters,
even
which
remember
I
what I'm
could
talking
name.
about anymore. All right, we're going to take a quick break. We come back, Morgan Harper running in Ohio's 3rd District, and then we will be talking to Ganesh Sitaraman. Morgan, you're running for Ohio's 3rd District as a primary challenger to a 4-term incumbent, Representative Joyce Beatty. Tell us a little bit about the Ohio's 3rd District.
Yeah, so Ohio's 3rd District is a gerrymandered district, a very safe Democratic seat, and just in terms of, demographic makeup and all that. So it's entirely in Franklin County, which is the county where Columbus, Ohio sits, but it actually is made up of, more communities outside of Columbus, Reynoldsburg, Whitehall, Bexley, some other cities. And, it's 30% Black, 11% foreign-born, 6% Latino. So, very, very diverse community, but also one that has seen a lot of the other side of the economic picture that our country is experiencing, and that, for 50% of the people, the economic boom and the economic growing that's happened in Columbus has not hit them. Wages have been fairly stagnant, and that can be especially acute in a state with a minimum wage of $8.55.
Wow. And what of the opioid crisis out in Ohio? I mean, Ohio's been in the news quite a bit, not necessarily Franklin County, but I'm just curious as to what extent has that been taxing the resources of that community?
Opioid crisis is huge. So, even though some of the national stories focus on other parts of Ohio, certainly within Franklin County and within the 3rd District, there are a lot of people that are either experiencing addiction themselves or have family members that have experienced or unfortunately already passed away from addiction. And so that's a big issue. And and that's one of the things I have on the platform, Medicare for All. We need to get people treatment and not criminalize addiction, and also get people the resources that allow them to restabilize their lives, having housing that is affordable, having jobs that, identify a path beyond just life in the streets that's going to be economically feasible. So, there's a lot of things that my platform is getting at that will help to address that crisis. But yeah, it certainly has hit a lot of communities within the 3rd District hard.
All right, so we're doing a series essentially of primary challengers to Democrats, particularly with a focus on ones who have are primarying the incumbent from the left. But give us a sense of what it is that made you jump into this race. What did you see that the incumbent wasn't doing that you felt needed to be done?
Yeah, so, I was born in the 3rd District at Ohio State Hospital. Ohio State is in the district, and I was given up for adoption. I lived in a foster home and was adopted and raised on the east side. And, my family went through a lot, especially early on in my life, but it opened up opportunity for me to get financial aid to go to an elite college prep school, Columbus Academy, that is also in the district, and really showed me, economic segregation, income inequality at a very early age, and set me on the path I've been on to try to do something about that. And, what I had increasingly been seeing in the last year or so is that, what we're doing, the incremental policy approaches of the last 40 years are not working. And we know that to be true because communities in this district have either unchanged poverty levels or formerly middle-class areas have slowly deteriorated over the course of my lifetime. And we need to be moving faster. And in fact, there is a movement that's moving with urgency to actually pass legislation that's going to do something about making sure everybody has access to health care, a home, doing something about the environment, these really systemic issues. And so for me, I had to be honest with myself. It's like, this is what I'm about, and this is the movement that's happening right now. And I felt like real people living in this district would support a more progressive platform if given the opportunity. And so we decided to go for it and launch this on July 1st.
So you've been at it now for about, I guess, quick math, 3 or 4 months. Give me a sense of how it's going. I mean, I want to move in. Well, before we get there, actually, because I'm really curious about your about how you grew up and that sort of that dichotomy of coming from in a foster home and being adopted. Living, a home life being one where there was a lot of economic stress, financial stress, but at the same time having access to going to a school with a lot of wealthy people. And I'm curious just about that experience because, we've interviewed people in the past where there's been some research on that. I'm just curious as to, how that realization came and how that adjustment was.
I mean, I think it was one of the most pivotal moments of my life. From the moment I stepped foot onto that campus and recognized at age 10 that, I thought everybody was leading kind of a similar type of life. And, by no means was I living in destitute, conditions or anything. I was fortunate. My mom worked in the public school system, so that equals stable job, benefits, union, all of these things that enable families and individuals to weather a lot of different types of financial stresses, but there were stresses nonetheless, right? And then you go into an environment where you see that there are just unlimited resources for kids and families that are never experiencing that type of stress. And it had a huge impact on me. And I think especially when you're adopted, you're aware that, your life could have gone in a lot of different directions and it's not so special you as an individual, right? I mean, it's kind of random how you end up. And so really feeling like this can't be that just because of the zip code you're born into or the school district, or if your parents happen to have money, that you sometimes get science class and sometimes you don't. And then like I experienced, then you get into this environment where not only are we doing science all the time, but we're going to have a science lab for 10-year-olds that they have access to. And I still remember that moment of getting into classrooms in the prep school and you could hear the fish tanks bubbling, right? And you're like, wow, that was a level of peace and quiet in the classroom that I had never known before. And so, But you didn't have to travel very far. I mean, I think that's the interesting thing about this district, even though, it's like geographically wide, taking up a lot of Franklin County, these areas are not that far apart. So for me, that was a 15-minute drive journey from the life that I had known into a whole different ballpark of existence. And these contrasts are so stark and sometimes just very block to block that, you have to be honest with yourself about like, what are we doing here, right? And how are anyone in this community, are we really saying they're of different value than someone who is that 15-minute drive away? And that was never okay with me. And I don't think that's really the vision of the American dream that we claim to care about.
Being adopted and having that insight about how randomized and lucky, how much luck has to do with the luck of birth, and I guess and just subsequent to that, implicates the rest of your life is fascinating. And we should say you went on to go to Tufts. You got an advanced degree at Princeton, and then you went on and got your legal degree at Stanford, and then worked for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Give me a sense of, I mean, that must have been when it was almost a completely new agency. Give us a sense about your experience there.
Yeah, that was an incredible experience. I mean, after the financial crisis, we all saw, right, there are a lot of people, and we continue to see that, were really hit hard by that, and recovery took a long time and it's still continuing. And so, being able to be part of a federal agency that was actually realizing the vision I have for the federal government, where, it has resources and a mandate to actually get something done for working people, incredible experience. And we did it, $12 billion back to 28 million consumers over the course of time there. And you saw that, it is possible to actually hold companies accountable when they are trying to prey on working people that really just need markets and financial products to be fair without, really having the time to read through the fine print. And so that's what we were working to fight for at the CFPB. And so I started in the Office of Regulations there doing rule writing. I was part of the rulemaking team that wrote rules to regulate the prepaid card market. It was a financial alternative, financial product to a traditional checking account that hadn't really had robust regulation before. And then I served as a senior advisor to the first director of the Bureau and oversaw, payday lending legislation or regulation development, policy development, credit reporting, mortgage servicing, a whole host of things. But, it was, it truly is what we should have the federal government do. So that's a big part of my platform is, the things like housing, making sure that people earn enough money to live. These are the things that we need the federal government to actually be investing resources into. And this is something the federal government used to do, but we kind of got to get back on track and recognize that that is the most responsible use of resources for the federal government to be using.
Developing a commitment to the idea of financial stability, and that's the first point, your plank, I should say, on your platform. Financial stability, and specifically the programs of universal child care, jobs guarantee, tuition-free public college, universal income, federal minimum living wage, Medicare for all. Those are incredibly ambitious programs. What's the one that you think, if you had to prioritize one, what would you say is the most important?
It's pretty hard to say. I mean, I have all of them on there, and that's, feedback I certainly got when we launched is like, whoa, Morgan, this is kind of everything. It's like, yeah, this is everything, because these are the things that we need, that working people need to be okay. And, like we talked about before, I mean, I've seen what it's like when, families experience stress, when things start to go off the rails a bit, and what it takes to actually stabilize and weather those types of storms. And we're now putting people, individuals, families in positions where they are completely vulnerable to any type of stress, right? And that's not okay. And so how do we fight back against that? We fight back against that by making sure that people are earning enough money to live, that they're not getting sunk by medical costs that everyone is prone to experience. And if you don't, well, God bless you, but it's probably coming, right? And so a lot of these are systemic things like Medicare for all, universal child care, which is also becoming almost like a middle-class issue for people, even people that are earning, fairly decent wages are feeling the crunch of not being able to afford reliable and good quality childcare. But then also we need to think about the realities of, as we work towards these systemic solutions of bottom line, what's happening to people right now. And, we saw at the CFPB that a lot of families, and the research has been done by the Federal Reserve, that a lot of families, individuals, are not able to meet their expenses month to month because of $400 shortfalls in one of the richest countries in the world, right? So that's not okay. So that's why I have some, on their universal income, because we need to kind of like plug that gap right away as we work towards some of this more systemic change. So, but ultimately what's driving my platform is the building blocks of what people need to be stable, and it's not complicated, and we used to do it, and we've got to get back to it, which is housing, earning enough money to live, doing something about the climate. Now, we also did recently add to the platform public safety, addressing police, how we approach policing in our communities, which has been a big issue in the 3rd District, and certainly making sure that we don't have people dying at the hands of police and through police violence is another important component of making sure that neighborhoods, individuals, families are able to thrive.
And we should say you also support the Green New Deal, which includes at least some of those planks of the platform of financial stability. I also noticed that you talk about stable housing, which is not something that you hear a lot from congressional candidates. I have a sense of why it's that important. Today, it was just reported this week in New York City, over 100,000 students who go to school every day have no homes, and
crazy.
It's crazy. But just talk a little bit about your ideas of housing.
Yeah, this was an important one to me to, lead with, because I actually have a bit of a professional background in this. So, before launching this campaign, I was working for an organization called LISC, Local Initiative Support Corporation, that invests in affordable housing. And in that position, I was traveling around the country and seeing the affordable housing crisis that is taking place across America and the accompanying homelessness crisis, to your point there. And, really, it's a systemic issue. What is happening in every single major metropolitan area in our country, it is a systemic issue, and that's when we need the federal government to step up and do something about it. And, and locally in Franklin County, there's a 54,000 unit gap for affordable housing. Why? Because housing prices are increasing because the population is growing and the economy is growing, but not for everyone, and wages have stagnated, so people cannot keep up. Affordable housing, affordable for whom? That's a big refrain that we're hearing in the 3rd District. And so, I have on the platform there, part of that is just increasing the supply, making sure that we are producing more housing, but also putting pressure on substandard landlords that are putting substandard housing onto the market to force them to do something about that, and also thinking about national rent stabilization, so the role that federal policy could play in putting some limitations on how much property owners, landlords are able to profit off of, basic necessity, which is housing, as we have more and more renters that are in our market, given, the pressures of outside investors buying property and all of that. So it's just so fundamental, like you said earlier, people that are going through drug addiction, for example. I mean, you're never going to bounce back from something like that when you can't even get a stable home. So
Right.
it's a really important part of anyone's life.
When you announced in July, I think you had told The Intercept that you saw AOC, Ayanna Pressley, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, the so-called squad, as role models. I mean, give us a sense of how you perceive, I guess the way that they are exercising and accumulating power, how you see yourself, your perspective on power, and how you would wield it in the context of Congress, specifically, those 4 in particular, but also other members of the freshman class have been much more aggressive, both in terms of progressive policies, but also from a partisan standpoint than we've seen in the past from Democrats. I want to just get your take on that.
Well, I think what I find inspiring about them and what they're doing is they're driving agendas that are informed by people, by their constituents. And, that's certainly where I'm coming from with this in launching a grassroots campaign that is 100% people driven is, then the mandate you have is coming directly from the people. So you move as urgently as the people are feeling the issues that they're going through. And trust me when I tell you that in the 3rd District, there are a lot of people that are feeling an incredible amount of urgency around the issues that our platform is addressing, and expect our representatives to be doing more. And that's why so many people are coming out to support our progressive platform. So, that once you're there and once I'm there and part of Congress, you're then able, that is what is informing your voice, what committees you're on to address that platform, and coming into these positions with a platform that already, that people are paying attention to what you're saying and what you're doing, and trying to bring that accountability to Congress. And, I think it's a whole different playbook. And this was certainly true for me in launching this campaign. No one from the party said it was my turn or anything like that. And so I entered to, the running as a Democrat and all of that, I'm entering to get things done. I'm not looking to build a career. And I think that's what we need to have more of, is people in Congress that are coming with an agenda to accomplish things quickly, move efficiently, and get results for the constituents as quickly as we can. So that's certainly a model that we're seeing now is people are having more success with, and you're seeing it play out in that there are a lot of people like me that are challenging incumbents and really trying to drive the legislation that we know is going to have an impact for working people and make sure our economy works for everyone.
That's great. And we should say that you've had tremendous fundraising, the vast majority of which under $100 in terms of donations, but wildly successful. And people can find more information at morganharper.org, where you've got your platform. And I imagine you're looking for support, both in terms of dollars and in terms of volunteers. Morgan Harper, running in Ohio's 3rd District. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Morgan Harper, folks, check out her website. You can find it in our podcast description. Ladies and gentlemen, healthy, plant-based, non-toxic cleaning products work. And the good ones are actually more enjoyable to use because you're not terrified of poisoning yourself or your pets or your kids. But where do you start? Who do you trust? That's where Grove Collaborative comes in. Grove Collaborative, it's the online marketplace that delivers all natural home, beauty, and personal care products directly to you. Grove takes the guesswork out of going green because every grove.co, that's not a typo, folks,
product is guaranteed to be good for you, your family, your home, and the planet. I get a whole mess of Mrs. Meyer's cleaning products. The soap, the dish soap, the concentrate. The Grove.co has their own brand of concentrates that are also awesome as well. But it was super helpful. I mean, I don't know cleaning products that well. I'm living on my own. The Grove guide was super helpful on there. But a lot of people know just what they want, and it's all there. All plant-based, none of the harsh chemicals, none of the dangerous chemicals. You can join over 2 million lifetime customers who trust Grove Collaborative to make their homes a happier and healthier. Plus, shipping is fast and free on your first order. For a limited time, when listeners go to grove.co/majority, you're going to get a free 5-piece cleaning set from Mrs. Meyer's and Grove. That's a $30 value. Go to grove.co/majority to get this exclusive cleaning offer. Grove.co/majority. Check it out. Folks, you know that I talked just about yesterday where I said I was upping my sartorial choices. Well, when I go out styling, I don't want to look too sophisticated, but I want to look more sophisticated than when I'm wearing my junky ass sneakers. That's where my Cariumas come in. They're sustainable sneakers, and they're the footwear of the future. That's why there's a big waiting list for Cariuma's low-impact kicks, approximately 5,000 people deep. Cariuma is a DTC sustainable sneaker brand. Their high and low top styles are good looking, they're crazy comfortable, and they're conscientiously made. Cariuma shoes are brand new, but they come with that perfect broken in fit with the old school design and new school ethics. Check out these babies. Back in the day when I was a kid, I was wearing Chuck T's, but they're not good for your back, man. I don't mean to. These things look sweet. Stylish. Their Oka and Katiba sneakers are made with premium natural materials that are sourced responsibly. Plus, Cariuma just launched their 100% vegan and carbon neutral sneaker, the IB. It's made with 3D bamboo knit and recycled PET, green EVA outsoles made from sugar cane, a cork and organic Mamona oil insole, and recycled laces, threads, and labels. All their styles come with their signature crazy comfy green insoles. Their packaging is made from recycled and 100% recyclable materials. And by purchasing carbon offsets, they're creating a shipping footprint balance of 0. And if your pair doesn't fit you perfectly, you return them free of charge. These things are awesome. Honestly, they are incredibly comfortable. Like now I'm having that bummed out feeling where I get them dirty and I start to think like, wait a second, maybe I shouldn't wear them. I don't know how people deal with that because I've never had sneakers before that I actually sort of like wear with some measure of pride. I just used to put them on.
I'm a Midwesterner. I get made fun of for how dirty my shoes are here sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's the way I used to be too, but these things, I want to keep them clean. For a limited time, our listeners can get an exclusive 15% off your first pair of Cariuma sneakers. That's Cariuma, Cariuma.com/majority to get 15% off. That's Cariuma, Cariuma.com/majority for 15% off today. Check it out. And lastly, today's show is in part brought to you by Capterra. You've heard me talk about Capterra many times before. It's I don't use it exactly the way that other people do, because for me, it's like it's not just the biggest free online resource that millions use monthly to find software solution for their business. They have something like 700 specific categories of software with, I think it's like, I don't know how many reviews it is. Thousands upon thousands. No, over a million reviews they have now for all these 700 categories. And then there's like 20 software in each one of these categories. I'm just eyeballing it. You do the math because I can't do the math. You know I can't do the math. 1,400, 14,000 maybe different pieces of software. but it's all categorized by businesses. And I go there and I just scroll through all the businesses. I didn't even know you could, 90% of these things were even businesses. I had no idea. Go through, you can find software for your dog shampoo business, your dog walking business.
It's software you've heard of too, like our live streaming software is on there too, but then you can also get a sense of what the competitors are too.
Exactly. So watch out. I'm not going to name our
Better shape up.
But exactly. No kidding. I wonder, actually, we should go in there and just check and see how how our software rates against other softwares.
I've looked at a few other ones on the Capterra website, actually.
Watch out. Look, Capterra simplifies your software search into just a few steps. You use their free resource and guides to pinpoint the problem and identify the software features you need. Then you can filter options, find the right software for your industry. There are more than 700 specific categories. Like I say, you compare them side by side. Save your favorites to a short list. Spend less time trying to find software and more time doing what you do best. Visit Capterra.com/majority for free today to find the software tools you need for business. Capterra.com/majority. Capterra, that's CAPTERRA. CAPTERRA.com/majority. Capterra, software selection simplified. Now, Ganesh Sitaraman on the Great Democracy. We are back. Sam Cedar on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome back to the program the professor of law from Vanderbilt Law School and author of his most recent, The Great Democracy, How to Fix Our Politics, Unrig the Economy, and Unite America. Ganesh Sitaraman, welcome back to the program.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here, Sam.
And we should say, last time you were here, we were talking about your book, The Crisis of the Middle Class Constitution, where, among other things, you argued that a democracy like ours is unsustainable, or any democracy, I guess, is unsustainable with the level of wealth inequality that we have here, or just broadly speaking. And I want to get into this book where you begin with the argument that we have been living in a neoliberal era, and that has come to an end. Before we do, define for us what your definition is of neoliberalism.
Great. Well, thanks so much. Yeah. So the first argument in the book is that we've lived for the last 40 years in a neoliberal era. And I know neoliberalism is a tough word. It's a word that I think a lot of people don't particularly like these days. Some people see it as a slur. Others see it as just confusing because it may mean so many different things. But really the policy components of neoliberalism, I think, are pretty simple. And there's 4 pieces to it. First is deregulation. The second is liberalization in trade. Third, privatization of public services. And fourth is austerity. We're not going to raise taxes, and we're going to spend less money from the public fisc. So those are the 4 kind of policy components that we think of in politics and economics. And I think that's the core of neoliberalism. And as I argue in this section of the book, it really started as a kind of policy core that over time expanded, built, and became a kind of ideology that really took over almost all aspects of how we think and how our lives work today.
What were the mechanisms in which that bled in? These ideas were born, or at least maybe codified at Mount Pelerin right after World War II, and then basically. It was like I guess all the spores were blown across the world, as it were, and allowed to germinate. Was this just a question of, well, it was going to take a decade or two for this stuff to really take root, or what? Like, why did this happen?
So I think there are a variety of reasons for why and how any ideology takes over. One part of it is just time, as you mentioned. It takes time for ideas to migrate into the world from the kind of scribblings of academics. And I say that as an academic, so I think I'm allowed to say that. But But the other part of it is that a big portion was, first, there were people in power who took them seriously and tried to implement them. So in America, it's Ronald Reagan and his administration. In Britain, it's Margaret Thatcher and hers. And that's a starting point. But I think where it really takes over and turns into a kind of dominant ideology of the era is when both sides of the political spectrum adopt roughly the same worldview. Now, there are always differences, and I want to be clear about that. There are always differences. But what is striking is when you go back to the kind of middle of the neoliberal era, it's Bill Clinton who says the era of big government is over and whose administration deregulates Wall Street and telecom. It's Tony Blair who turns labor into new labor. And shifts things in Britain as well. And in fact, in previous eras, you see this similar kind of phenomenon. So I argue that this neoliberal era that's been around for 40 years or so itself was a development that took over from a previous era, which I would call a liberal era with a small l. And in that era, an era of regulated capitalism, in which big government, big business, and big labor all sort of work together in the interests of stakeholders, more or less. What's striking is even conservatives agreed with that approach. So it was Nixon who said, "I am now a Keynesian in economics," something that seems very striking when you think about neoliberals of the later era. One of the things that I think makes these ideas dominate is when everyone on all sides, or most people on both sides, start taking them seriously and adopting them in how they think about policy, politics, economics, and the world.
All right. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, but maybe in some respects, we may return to this question. But is what you're describing simply a sort of a cultural phenomena that impacts individuals, or is there an inherent structural problem that existed even in those years that sometimes people refer to as the Great Compression, right? Where there was more economic equality. There wasn't necessarily, the same level of civil equality for huge swaths of our population. But was there something that structurally there that made it susceptible to that type of cultural virus? Right. I mean, in other words, is the terrain just too? I guess Piketty argues, right, that was the anomaly. That was the aberration. That we're reverted to the mean is neoliberalism. I mean, do you agree with that broad perspective, or was there something that happened structurally at that time?
Well, I think the way that we should look at this, and this is first a step pretty far back, is how do we think about history? And part of what I argue in the book is that we shouldn't think about history as being a kind of straight line or as an equilibrium that exists that is permanent and maybe every once in a while there are blips. Actually, there's an element of cycles and change that are like the tides. They ebb and flow back and forward, or just change over time as a general matter, and that we can't escape that. And so when I think back to the mid-20th century and to what I call the liberal era, which goes from about World War II through the 70s, what's striking is what happens during that period. The people of that era rein in economic power during the New Deal. They expand economic opportunity with the GI Bill, with the investments of the New Frontier. They fight a war on poverty as part of the Great Society. And in the middle of all of that, they're struggling to end Jim Crow, to integrate the nation racially, to promote equal rights for women, for people of color. And the reason is, they know that you can't have real equality and solidarity in a country if you have segregation. And so there's a move for real democracy that is both a political democracy and an economic democracy, and a sense of social solidarity across our differences in that period. But that era, as we get toward the end of it, also comes with war in Vietnam, economic crisis in the 70s, social, political crises of different kinds. And with that, there is an exhaustion to this liberal era and the need for change. Some of that's generational, some of that is temporal, some of that's global. But in the sense of that need for change, what we get is the neoliberal era, the emergence of this new ideology, or at least different, maybe a better way of putting it, that had been around for a little while. And that neoliberal focus on individualism and market ideology really prevents, I argue, the realization of democracy, because it puts economic growth above a strong middle class that leads us to the century-high levels of inequality that we have. It emphasizes individuals over communities. And because it prefers markets to democracy, it also, over time, looked away as the wealthiest people and big corporations rigged the government to serve their own interests. And so, what I think happens is we see these shifts, and they're partly a function of the crises of that period. And I think they're instructive. I think it's instructive to think about history this way, because what we see now is at the end of this era, the end of the neoliberal era, when we look back, a kind of similar arc that, we had the wars in the 2000s, we have the Great Recession, we have these extremely high levels of inequality, this deep imbalance of economic power, social fracturing in multiple different ways. And it's why this current era really has no solutions to the problems that we face, and why we're in search of something new, why we're at this moment where there could be a new approach, a new ideology, a new paradigm that could really define our politics for the next generation.
All right, before we get to why you think that we're at the cusp of a new era, let me just a couple of things I just want to talk about that era. That notion of looking away while some try to rig government. I mean, my understanding of neoliberalism is that in fact that's sort of embedded in it, right? That the idea wasn't so much that we want total laissez-faire. We just want government to function for a narrow few because we know what we're doing on some level, and that leads on some level from going from a plutonomy to a plutocracy. I think everybody sort of understands that. At least we hear about that quite a bit in the context of, we have oligarchs and we have at least multiple, I guess now we have, 3 people who are vying to be president in 2020 who are billionaires and just basically have bought themselves into it. And Trump has now got other resources. But will you talk about the idea of how this era of neoliberalism was also marked by the difference between positive and negative rights?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things, we think about as good small L liberals in America is freedom. And it's really important. It's a huge part of our history. It's a huge part of our culture and who we are and how we define ourselves and what we seek as an aspiration. And what's striking is that there's a really specific kind of freedom that we get from neoliberalism. It's a freedom in which people are autonomous, government is minimized, and markets are the thing that structures people's choices. But what's so striking about that, and there's this great quote from a sociologist named Zygmunt Bauman, who says, never have we been so free, never have we felt so powerless. And I think that's a really interesting point because, after decades of this sense where people are autonomous, we're going to reduce government, we're going to, extremely expand markets, we feel powerless. But freedom should be giving us power. It should make us feel independent. It should make us have that ability to control our own lives. And so there's this deep tension here. And I think it really gets to this core, if you'll let me kind of nerd out for a moment, a philosophical distinction between two kinds of liberty. And the first one, is often called the liberty of the ancients or positive liberty or public freedom. And the idea here is freedom is the ability to participate actively in self-government. And so this is like ancient Athens, where we think about democracy as people gathering themselves to make decisions and govern themselves. And in the mid-20th century, there were a number of political philosophers who said actually, the exercise of freedom in a real sense means also social rights, housing, healthcare, income. And you can't have positive freedom and liberty, the ability to do something, unless you have that.
The four freedoms that FDR talks about. And
the four freedoms are a great example of kind of thinking about the broader sense of what's needed for freedom than just the right to vote, for example, or the right to deliberate in government. But there's another type of freedom, and the other type has been called the liberty of the moderns, or negative liberty, private liberty. And the idea here is that what freedom is freedom from constraints. And often this is framed around freedom from the constraint of government, freedom from government regulations. And this fear of government really dominates the neoliberal worldview, and it crowds out a lot of other things. And, I think there's some reason for this. Neoliberalism kind of emerges in the Depression, World War II period and is worked out in the Cold War. And so there's this fear of the overbearing fascist or communist state that we see abroad. And so that's part of what's going on in the background. But what this approach to freedom really misses is what I think of as the freedom of the progressives, or freedom of small r Republicans. And what that is that we should fear power of any type, in any form, and in any place, whether that's public power or private power, because any accumulation of power can oppress people and create freedom. So in that sense, what we should be worried about is not just government that might oppress people, but corporations that might oppress people or cheat them or have too much power over their workers. Those are also things that undermine freedom. And I think neoliberalism's approach to freedom, this kind of narrow approach that it's really just about government, is a problem for that reason. And I know I've been talking a little while, but let me just add one last thing with that, because it gets to your question. When you don't have a political component to it, when you don't see that private power can also make you unfree, what that means is you unleash private power to capture government and use the government to make people unfree as well. And I think that's partly what we've seen, is when you think that everything can be regulated through the market, we still do have a government, and it just means that market actors can try to influence the government and then turn it to their own ends. And I think that's a big problem of what we're seeing in our country today.
I've had many, far too many arguments with libertarians over the years, and the one of the refrains that I've heard, not so much in the ones that call me, the ones I run into out in the wild more, that are funded by the Koch brothers or something to that effect, is that corruption is a problem because we give government too many responsibilities, and so it becomes like a honeypot for corruption, as opposed to this what you're talking about, where the that it's really about a dynamic between these different forces that is problematic, regardless of who has more power in that dynamic. It's the dynamic that must maintain some tension to basically keep everybody in check.
Yeah, it's interesting. There was this debate a few years ago between Ted Cruz and Bernie Sanders on I think it was on CNN, but there was a debate between the two of them, and Ted Cruz, said something like, if the problem is that government's corrupt, then why would you want more power in Washington with the government? And I think, that's a refrain you hear frequently, but the problem with that is that it collapses into the problem that we just had. If you don't have any power in government, then who is there to defend us from private tyranny, from the oppression that might come from the private sector? Because fundamentally what it is government is something that we together have and use to help us achieve our common goals, but also to protect us from private oppression, whether that's someone who picks your pocket or is cheating thousands of people. That's what we have laws and regulations for, which is basically action through the government. That's what laws and regulations are for. And so I think it has this problem to it. And the answer, in the context of seeing the corruption in government, isn't let's abandon government. It's we should reform it and make it actually work for us, the people, instead of working for a small set of interests.
So why do you think that we are, aside from the general feeling, but why do you feel that we're at the end of this neoliberal era?
Well, I think there's a few reasons for this. One is that we've really, followed this arc that I mentioned earlier,
Right.
from the kind of emergence of a set of ideas to its adoption by both sides, to crises and exhaustion and a sense that the ideas no longer really fit the moment, if they ever fit it that well in terms of accomplishing things. They certainly don't have much to speak to it now, and that there's something different that can better address the problems that we face. And I think that's the kind of moment that we're in now, is we've really seen the exhaustion of these kind of neoliberal ideas. Nobody believes really today, or at least with a straight face, that the same kinds of policies of deregulation, austerity, trade liberalization, and privatization that were so much the rage starting in the 80s are relevant to solving the problems of climate change, economic inequality, social fracturing, corporate power, and a wide variety of the other challenges we face. So I think there's a sense of this deep disconnect, and that it's time for a new paradigm. And the question going forward, though, really is, what's that new paradigm going to look like?
All right. Well, so let's talk about that. What are you list a couple of possibilities as to what that new paradigm will look like. Let's look at the ones that you think are less likely. Just sort of, I guess, a more inclusive neoliberalism. What would that look like, and why do you think that is not where we're going?
So I think one of the possibilities is what I call a reformed neoliberalism, or we could think of it as a new neoliberalism. And the basic idea here is to keep more or less the structure of our neoliberal system in place, not get at the root causes or the foundational problems, but just try to mitigate the worst effects of neoliberalism. I think sometimes we see this these days with people who just wish we could get things back to normal in sort of a nostalgic sense, or we think we can make some incremental changes, but we don't really need to think about the deep structural problems that exist. And I think this is a real challenge. There may be in the short run of a year or two or a few years some interest in this idea, but the challenge is it really threatens more of the same. If we don't get at the structural challenges, it's hard to really address inequality. It's hard to address social fracturing, and it's hard to see how slight mitigation of some of the harms doesn't still just lead to demagogues waiting in the wings, ready to kind of take over and destabilize the system. So, in terms of that being a sustainable future for, say, a generation, I don't think that that's a viable option forward.
You also talk about a nationalist populism, where I guess presumably Stephen Miller would be president in that situation.
I think in part I think of this as like a Steve Bannon kind of an approach, and the idea here is a mixing of, or at least an approach in the sense of the rhetoric he often has, which is a mixing of economic populism, economic nationalism, with nationalism. So a mix of those two kinds of things. And what I think is challenging about this approach is that it's not clear that there's anybody who is in the governing side of the world who actually believes this, minus maybe Steve Bannon and a few other people, but there aren't many. And seeing President Trump's administration is sort of instructive in this sense. He ran more on this kind of thing, against trade deals, but also with a hefty sense of nationalism. But as a president governing, has really not been in that position. He's taken a different approach, one that I call nationalist oligarchy, and think is a lot more likely. And that approach is a mix of nationalism, that's remained, but the policies, rather than being economically populist, are actually policies that serve the wealthy and well-connected quite well. So big tax cuts, deregulation, that kind of thing. And then the third component of this system of nationalist oligarchy is really rigging the political system so that you can stay in power. And I think this is an approach that we're seeing around the world, in fact, not just emergent here, but in places like Russia and Hungary. And I think it's important that we characterize this as nationalist oligarchy, not as just authoritarianism, even though there's a lot of books and articles that think about it that way, because I think the economics really matters a lot, and so does the social policy. And authoritarianism gives us this feel of the kind of political and constitutional challenges and transformations, but it really misses that this isn't just about constitutional norms or institutions. It's also about economics. It's also about social power and social pressures. And nationalist oligarchy, I think, captures that a little bit better. So unlike the kind of Bannon approach, this nationalist oligarchy approach, I think, could potentially be a future that we might see. I mean, it's not a desirable one, I think, but it's a future that we might see, and we've seen it in lots of places around the world.
So just so I'm clear about the difference between authoritarianism and the nationalist oligarchy, is that authoritarianism is probably something more akin to Saddam Hussein, right, who had alliances, but they were more political. He wasn't competing. He wasn't organizing, a series of billionaires around who were controlling the economic structures and sort of like just simply organizing them and building them in such a fashion that they all had to just check a box with him, as much as it was sort of just other, structural things in terms of factions and whatnot. Whereas, is that like a good distinction, or?
Yeah, I think that gets at something. What I think is really important about the distinction is really that we describe what we're thinking about in a way that we capture the political economy of it,
right,
as opposed to ignoring it. And I think even when we think back to Nazi Germany and fascism, there's a component of that that's also economic that we don't usually think about, but that we should also think about. So every even an authoritarian state has an economy to it. And what I'm hoping to call out with framing this as nationalist oligarchy is to put some emphasis on the oligarchy part as well, so that we don't lose sight of that. Because I think part of our challenge is we need to see that we have to address the political problems, the economic problems, and the social problems, all three, and we can't pull them apart, and we can't only address one and ignore the others. It's really about all of it together, and that's a core component. And it's interesting because when you go back even to the 30s and 40s, one of the striking things in that period is that the New Dealers believed that part of the problem, certainly not all of it, but a component of how to think about what happened in Germany was the problem of cartels and economic power and how it was intertwined with the state. And so afterwards, in the Marshall Plan era, they actually worked to try to bring antitrust and competition policy to Germany rather than having a cartel policy. And part of that was they were thinking about political freedom. They were thinking about religious freedom. They were thinking about social policy and mass movements and propaganda and all those questions that we've, that we all know well. But they were also thinking about economic issues as part of this too. And so I just don't want us to lose that component as we think about this.
Right. I mean, so it's an authoritarianism that is built with a huge economic component that has its own sort of structural problems or
and I've
challenges.
seen some people call this authoritarian capitalism. I think that's a reasonably good term for it as well.
Okay.
But that's the idea, is that it's capturing this kind of fusion between a certain type of politics and a kind of economics that is redistributive upward, is corrupt, and that's part of the story here.
Just doesn't sound as scary as authoritarianism, but it's almost like scaffolded more strongly in some ways.
If you have better branding ideas or better terms, happy to take ideas.
I will workshop that. Right now, I just have scary nationalist oligarchy, and I don't think that does it. But so then the other opportunity that you see that we're basically, you're describing, we're at a crossroads here in some respects, is the title of your book, A Great Democracy. What would that look like? What are the elements that we need to implement if we are to have a great democracy? But first, I guess, what does that mean, a great democracy?
Yeah, so, well, I'll first talk a little bit about democracy. The thing that's really striking, I think, is that these days, when we worry about our democracy, I think a lot of us are rightly very worried about voting, about elections, about constitutional norms, about institutions and their erosion. And that's been a lot of the focus, and I think for good reason, because it's really scary what's happening in all of those areas. But in addition to that, we also need to be worried about some other things, because democracy, for it to work, really requires more than just voting, elections, and institutions and norms. As you mentioned when we started chatting, my last book, The Crisis of the Middle Class Constitution, the argument that I make there is that since the ancient Greeks and Romans, philosophers and statesmen have understood that democracy cannot persist in a society with severe economic inequality, because either the rich will oppress the poor, creating an oligarchy, or the masses will overthrow the rich, with the demagogue leading the way to tyranny. And so if you don't have a economic democracy, a measure of economic equality, no one having too much economic power, you won't have a sustainable democracy, because it will collapse into either oligarchy or tyranny. Similarly, if we have a society that becomes too deeply divided by race, religion, clan, tribe, ideology, whatever it is, democracy also becomes difficult to sustain, because one group will try to oppress the other. And because ultimately what democracy is an exercise of freedom together. It's us determining as a group what we want our destiny to be. And if we're so divided that we have fundamentally opposed futures, democracy is hard to sustain. And so, Abraham Lincoln said a house divided against itself cannot stand. I think that's right, that an element of social solidarity is important for democracy. And then the third part, which is the closest to what we normally think of these days and what we're worried about, is that you have to have a political democracy to have a democracy, a government that's actually responsive to the people. But we don't have that either today. And what's so striking is, political scientist after political scientist has shown in studies that our government is mostly responsive to the wealthy and big corporations, not to ordinary people. And if you think about a government that is mostly unresponsive to the people, well, you wouldn't really call that a democracy at all. So I think we have a problem on all three of these fronts: economic democracy, social solidarity, and political democracy. And we need to tackle and try to achieve democracy along all three of these lines if what we want to do is actually achieve our aspirations for what a democracy is. And that's where the quote comes from. The quote's from Teddy Roosevelt, who said that a great democracy has got to be progressive, or it will soon cease to be either great or a democracy. And I think that's right in both senses of the term progressive. We have to be thinking about progress and change and how we move forward. But in our terms today, we need to think about being progressive and trying to build the kind of economic, political, and social democracy that we need.
I know you've got to go in about 4 or 5 minutes here, so let me sort of skip ahead to sort of the and I think programmatically, I think this audience is familiar with the notions of antitrust and a regulatory state and the idea of pre-distribution or pre-redistribution on some level, which is the idea that we would have policies like antitrust that would, rather than tax Bill Gates after the fact, prevent the amassing of that kind of wealth because it's unbalanced. And we may have to tax, in a sort of confiscatory way now to get down to the ability to sort of like have the power, the democratic power to stop that amassing of wealth. But let me just get to the nub here. Why not? What do you see as problematic with, let's say, the idea of like wholesale socialism versus these type of reforms? Because if the argument is like, we want to prevent this from cycling back, right? Like there was too much of a toehold for neoliberalism following this era of regulation and antitrust, and they were able to basically, amass that power that ended up inevitably coming down to this point where we have this sort of a plutonomy.
So I think that one of the things that's really striking is how much commonality there is in our country about how to move forward. And while a lot of people have different labels for it, what's striking is how much similarity there is in a lot of different places. If you look at tax policy, for example, there's a lot of people who I think identify as democratic socialists and who don't identify as democratic socialists, who all think it's astonishing that companies like Amazon pay nothing in taxes, or that millionaires and billionaires don't have to pay a wealth tax, or that the estate tax allows for passing down of wealth in a generational fashion that creates these hereditary, almost like a hereditary aristocracy, something that the founders were not interested in from the start. So it's striking to me that there's a lot of similarity in across some of these areas on these topics. So I think part of the question, if the question is, how much nationalization do people want? Right. If we're talking about that, in some places, I think there may be some differences on that. But what's striking, I think, is that, even if you look at what a lot of self-identified democratic socialists are looking for, it's actually, there's a lot of overlap with what other progressives, a lot of moderates, and even some conservatives are interested in. And that's, I think, another piece of what's striking about this moment is how much shift there is across different parts of the political spectrum where we're seeing people really move in their views. But when you go issue by issue, it's striking that it might be possible to make real change in a bunch of different areas with kind of odd bedfellow coalitions.
Interesting. Lastly, do you think the difference is, when we talk about it in that context, is really more about where we get the power to do these type of reforms?
Well, I think, part of the power, and when I say odd bedfellow of a coalition too, I mean the people, right? When you think about where the people are writ large in the country, what's so striking is that people agree on a lot of things. Right. And it's we often talk about how most of the country agrees on background checks in the gun context, for example, but the country agrees on a wealth tax. They agree on increasing Social Security. There's a lot of things that the country as a whole agrees on, but that Washington doesn't agree on and can't get through. And I think part of how change happens is a mix of having a sustained grassroots movement that can push for change from the outside, but also having sophisticated players on the inside who know how to get things through and get things done. And you need both of those things to work together in order to make change. I think that's the kind of special sauce that's necessary. Is it's both a kind of inside players and an outside game. And that's how progress usually happens.
The book is The Great Democracy: How to Fix Our Politics, Unrig the Economy, and Unite America. Ganesh Sitaraman, thanks so much for your joining us. We will put a link to The Great Democracy on our website at majorityreportradio.com.
Thanks so much for having me.
Don't forget, Capterra is the free online resource millions use monthly to find the best software solutions for their team or business, pinpoint the problem, and filter options to find the right software for your industry. There are more than 700 specific categories of software. That's nuts. Visit Capterra.com/majority for free today. Find the software tools you need for your business. Capterra, that's CAPTERRA.com/majority. Capterra. Software selection simplified.